nice to see you. Thanks for taking the time to have a conversation today.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm grateful to be here.
The logical place to start is just share with us who you are, your professional background.
Sure. So I grew up in Chicago. I worked for a couple of years for Amazon in their financial planning and analysis group. This is back like 2002 to 2004. So Amazon was still relatively small. At the time, the company was doing about $400 million of free cash flow. The goal was to get to $1 billion of free cash flow. Now I think the company probably does 40 or $50 billion of free cash flow. And everyone was in one building. And even though I was only there for 2 years, that was a very formative experience for a couple of reasons. One, the Amazon leadership principles have really had a lasting impact on me, not only from a business perspective, but just how I live my life perspective. Principles like have a bias toward action and a focus on frugality. Those leadership principles have really meaningfully impacted my life. Second, being out in Seattle, my wife and I just got married. We're both from the Midwest, and Seattle felt like an awful long way away. And after that experience, we moved back to the Midwest and really committed ourselves to be anchored in the Midwest, to raise our kids in the Midwest. I'm a huge homer of Chicago and St. Louis, where my wife's from, and spent a lot of time there too. But we came back to the Midwest and really decided to make a life here. And so when we came back, I went to law school. I went to Washington University in St. Louis. And my father had been an ERISA attorney for 40 years at the same law firm. And I knew that wasn't going to be me. It was a fantastic opportunity. He loved practicing law. But for me, the world's a big place. There's a lot of interesting things out there. And so I went into law school and eventually went to Kirkland & Ellis, which is a very large law firm that focuses on a lot of things. I focused on being a deal lawyer in the private equity space. But I went to law school and then to Kirkland largely from an optionality perspective. I think it was my view that I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do long term. This would enable me to work and see and do some really interesting things with folks who are really smart. And going through law school was a great challenge for me. And then joining Kirkland after law school really was an opportunity to learn a skill, how to do a private equity deal, but it was also an opportunity to just have some great experience with some really smart people. So I went to Kirkland. I'd summered there in 2007 and started there in 2008. And that's a really interesting period of time if you zoom out. When I summered at Kirkland, that was the height of the LBO market. We would have partners who would be sleeping under their desks or at the hotel next door trying to close deals. That fall, we had the credit meltdown. And so when I started in 2008 at Kirkland, the world was a much different place. The banks were largely closed from a financing perspective. The first deal I did for GTCR was an all equity deal. And of course, the L in LBO is leverage. So this was a much different world. And it had a real impact on my early years at the firm. I spent half of my first 2 years at Kirkland working on deal work for folks like GTCR and MDP and Bain Capital. I spent the other half of my time working on the Chicago Olympic bid, which was a public-private partnership. There was a lot of momentum at the time for that bid. And it was something that you'll see as a theme over and over in my career, which is trying to keep a foot in the private sector and also keep a foot in other adjacency things outside of, for instance, Kirkland, to just continue to get networked, build relationships, and frankly, just see interesting things. So I did that for a couple of years, and I got an inbound call about 2 years into my tenure at Kirkland. And it was from a mentor of mine who's actually from St. Louis. And she said, listen, I know you like hard things. I know you like public education, which is a big passion of mine. And she said, we've got a new superintendent taking over the St. Louis public schools. We've had 5 superintendents over the past 5 years. We'd really like this new superintendent to have the best opportunity to thrive. And we're building a team around him. Do you have any interest in taking a leave from Kirkland and coming down here for 4 months, 6 months, 9 months, and being the deputy superintendent, overseeing all of the operations for the district and help the district do very basic things? get the buses to kids' homes on time, oversee security, food service, finance, just all of the things that you need to do to support any organization that has a P&L like the schools did or does, which was about $250 million. And so I jumped at the opportunity. I took a leave of absence from Kirkland, went down to St. Louis, spent 6 months helping to lead the St. Louis public schools, ultimately came back to Kirkland about 6 months later, and then spent the following 15 years at Kirkland continuing to support large private equity firms, primarily with their deals, but also with financing transactions from a corporate governance perspective. And so what ended up happening, if we fast forward a few years, is I made partner at Kirkland. I was seeing up close our private equity sponsors do roll-ups, right? So the idea of a roll-up is you find a highly fragmented space. Maybe it's the home services space, pest control, HVAC, ITMSP. And the private equity firm will come into that industry, they'll make an anchor investment, and they'll start to buy up some of the competitors in the space and try to build that platform both organically as well as via M&A. And I was seeing these roll-ups take place in two ways. First, I was a deal lawyer. I was doing these deals to help these private equity firms or funds do their anchor acquisition or do some of their bolt-on activity. And second, I was a passive investor. I was a limited partner in a lot of these private equity funds. So I was also seeing the results of these roll-ups. And I was really enamored by this idea of multiple expansion, right? Warren Buffett often says that compounding is the eighth wonder of the world. I'm certain that multiple expansion is really the eighth wonder of the world. And of course, the idea of multiple expansion is if you buy something small, say $1 million of EBITDA, you might pay 4 times EBITDA from a valuation perspective. But what happens is, as you continue to grow a platform and you ultimately sell it, and EBITDA increases, when you go to sell that platform, if you sell a platform that's doing $8 million or $10 million of EBITDA, although your entry multiple for that asset or the component assets in that roll-up might only be 4 or 5 or 6 times EBITDA, your sale at $10 million of EBITDA might be 10 times, right? And so that variance between your entry multiple and your exit multiple, that's what we call multiple expansion. And what happens when you're able to achieve multiple expansion is it all goes to your equity account. Your overall financial return really balloons if you're able to buy assets at a relatively low multiple of cash flow or EBITDA and ultimately sell the business at a higher multiple. And so I was seeing this up close and I was like, man, this is really special. And I started to spend some time in 2014 figuring out how could I get more involved in doing deals and trying to capture multiple expansion as a core part of the investment thesis. And so we live in this neat town just north of Chicago, and I would go to all of my kids' soccer games, events at our church or for their schools, and I talked to a lot of the other folks in our community who were doing really neat things. Some of them were in private equity, some of them were owner-operators. And I started to look for somebody who I could partner with to start doing some deals. And the idea was that being at a large law firm could actually be enabling. It was a valuable brand. And so the thesis was if I could find somebody who can operate a business day to day, together we could go out and we could do some deals and we could build a platform and hopefully sell it and experience this multiple expansion. I ended up finding somebody from our community who had a background in computer science. He had bootstrapped a small software company and sold it to a private equity firm, made a few $1 million. Which sort of demonstrated to me that he knew something about something. But at the same time, it wasn't enough of a windfall that he was going to go retire on a beach. And we had a series of coffees, lunches, and dinners. And he said, listen, I think I want to leave where I'm working. He went to work for the private equity firm that bought his business and learned an awful lot doing roll-ups at that private equity firm. And he said, I think I want to go out and do something new, but I don't want to greenfield it. That was really hard. I think, like you, I want to go out and I want to buy and build. And so we started having a bunch of conversations to try to figure out how do we take some of the best ideas that he had and I had and fully develop it into an investment thesis that we had enough conviction around that we would execute on. We separately had a bunch of conversations with folks like Brian O'Connor and Mark Agnew, who run the search fund and ETA program at the University of Chicago. We met with some of the guys at Shore Capital who transact at a really high volume at the subscale end of the market. And all these guys were shaking us and saying, we think you've got a really good thesis. All of those guys transact at the subscale end of the market. They could see the vision of taking some of the skills that my partner had and I had and taking them down market and starting to do some deals at the subscale end of the market. So we ended up going out and we started looking for software businesses that we could buy and scale. And in doing a bunch of diligence and having a bunch of conversations with bootstrap founders of these small SaaS companies, we started to note a really interesting theme that we would see over and over again. And that theme was many of these technical founders had built a nice little business. Maybe they were doing $500,000 to $2 million of annual recurring revenue. They had very low churn. Their customers seemed to be very happy. But their businesses were only growing at a very low clip, often 1% to 3% a year. And as we dug deeper, what we learned was that it was intentional. The technical founders, something happened in their life. They wanted to buy a new house. Maybe their family grew. Maybe they were serial inventors or entrepreneurs and they wanted to start a new business. But something happened in their life and they decided to take the excess cash flow that their business was generating, and instead of reinvesting it in sales and marketing, they decided to put it in their pocket. And they were basically running their business like an annuity. And of course, that's fine. It's totally human nature to do that. But the problem is, as a result of this rule of 40, which basically says that for software companies, there are two things that drive a high valuation. Does your business have high margins? And is it growing quickly? If those two things are present, your software business is worth a lot. It might be worth 5 times revenue, 6 times revenue, 15 times revenue. But the dirty little secret is if you have a low growth SaaS business, like many of these guys that we were talking to did, even if it was high quality, it wasn't worth much. It was only worth 1 to 2 times revenue. And so we ended up developing a thesis which was, let's go out and find a highly fragmented space. We focused on the SEO MarTech space. And let's start buying competitors in that space. Let's look to pay an entry multiple of 1 to 2 times ARR, annual revenue. Let's bolt them all together. Let's seek to grow the platform to $8 million, $10 million, $12 million of top line, in which case we thought the buyer universe would flip over. It would start to be more private equity-ish. And let's really underwrite sales and marketing. Let's really focus on getting organic growth from 1 to 3% up to 25 or 30 or 35%. And the investment thesis was if we could do all of that, and that's a lot of different things to do, we thought we could exit that platform at a more normalized valuation multiple, somewhere around 5 or 6 times annual recurring revenue. So we ended up getting to work in 2015. We went out and we bought 3 businesses. We rolled them up. We really focused on sales and marketing and driving organic growth. And after a couple of years, we ended up getting pretty lucky. We got an inbound from Alpine Investors. Alpine's a large private equity firm. We probably have about $10 billion under management. They were putting about $300 million into a new SaaS platform focused on software businesses just like the ones that we had acquired. And they made us an offer, and we ended up getting to terms with them. And so we sold our platform to Alpine. We stuck around for a year to really focus on, we had an earnout equal to about 10% of our purchase price. So we stuck around to really see that through. And on the other side of the sale, I continued to practice law at Kirkland, but I really throttled back. And I started to spend a lot more of my time teaching. I teach courses on private equity and ETA at Washington University and at University of North Carolina, and I'll teach a private equity class at Northwestern this fall. And I started to invest a lot more in the subscale end of the market, mainly through some of my former students who are now out in the market doing their own full-time searches to acquire and operate small businesses.
Well, that's quite an interesting background, and I have a lot of questions. But I want to start with the experience at the St. Louis Public Schools. I think it's fair to say that's a fairly challenging school district. And even in the 6 months or so that you were there, I imagine you encountered quite a lot of opportunities to exercise some leadership skills. Could you perhaps share some stories there?
It was a very hard experience for many reasons. First, I was in my 20s. My daughter was probably 2. My son was actually born while we were down there. And so that was like the life stage that I was at. And so to parachute into a situation like that without a background in education, I didn't have a lot of, I had authority in name, but I didn't have sort of authority from an experience perspective. And so one of the first challenges was it was just very hard emotionally. 3 of our students were shot while I was in that role, and I oversaw security, and I need to zoom out of a meeting and rush over there and make sure that helps support what would be happening at the schools. From a crime perspective, that was very emotional and tolling for me. That district, not unlike a lot of public school districts, has a lot of deep-rooted entrenchment with unions. And I went into that basically thinking that if I worked hard and acted ethically and tried to do the right thing, I could easily build consensus around that. That was true in some respects. It wasn't true in other respects. I felt some of that deep-rooted entrenchment. I think a lot of folks probably fairly thought that I was just passing through while they had committed the entirety of their careers to educating our students. Also, just being on the operational side rather than being in the classroom, that necessarily limited my credibility. So that was a very challenging experience. I have no regrets about spending those 6 months. I really believe if we zoom out that we all need to continue to be focused on having great public education. That's an imperative for our local communities. But no doubt that experience was very challenging for me personally each and every day.
Yeah, I can't even imagine. My best friend is St. Louis City fireman, and I hear a lot about the challenges of moving a battleship. You talk about the entrenchment, just a long history of these institutions. I don't know if it's unique to our city or what.
I don't think it's unique. I mean, I'll just tell you one of the stories that's always really sat with me. I was going through a working session when we were talking about, I don't know if it was transportation or food service, really looking at the sort of the value chain and how you deliver a particular service. And I made the comment because I was really all about how do we push down as much autonomy to our managers. I mean, you really need folks to be able to make hard decisions on their own sometimes just to create leverage. And I said something to the effect of, listen, like, I'm indifferent for how we get to where we feel we need to get to improve this part of the value chain. It's just more about getting to that outcome. Someone very senior sent me an email after that meeting and basically turned my words on me and said something like, I can feel your indifference, and basically saying that I was indifferent about our students. And I certainly didn't feel that way at all. And that was very hard for me. I think it was hard for me too, because still being in my 20s, I was probably second guessing myself a lot more than I might have if I was a little bit further on in my career and had some experiences that would give me better conviction in how I was acting and some of the decisions that I was making. But that really stung. It really stung. Interestingly, though, it also led to one of my favorite memories, which was someone else on the senior team had pulled me aside. She could tell that I was upset about what had happened, and she gave me some good advice. She said, listen, you are all about the work. And I know you think that being all about the work and the outcome is what makes what you're doing feel objective and right to you. And she said, but it's not enough. You have to be more focused on the relational aspects of what you're doing and how you're doing. And I like years later, if I saw her, I would just want to give her a hug because she couldn't have been more right. Particularly early in my career, I was much more focused. And I feel like some of this was probably driven from my time at Amazon to be ultra focused on the outcome. That was my North Star, rather than investing a lot more into relationships and being a little bit more balanced between the relational aspects and being outcome determinative.
That's definitely good advice that I think perhaps particularly young men in their career need to hear early and often. I was probably very much the same way in my 20s. It was just hard charging, all about work and take the hill no matter who you have to beat down to get to the top. But I do want to spend a little bit of time to hear about what it's like being a senior partner doing M&A. What is that like?
Yeah. So I just flipped over last month. After 17 years, I'm now a retired partner at the firm. So I've really stepped back, and it's given me an opportunity to reflect a little bit more on those 17 years at the law firm. Those were challenging years, particularly early in my career there too. One of the things that's happened in the private equity space is if you're a private equity fund, your sole existence is doing deals, right? That's the anchor of what you do. And how do you demonstrate to a seller that you are the right buyer? Most of these deals are auction processes. There are two ways. You can, of course, offer the highest price, but you can also provide the best speed of execution and the highest probability that when you get to the closing table, you're going to get the deal done and closed. And so what that's resulted in is for a lot of these private equity firms to really put a lot of strain, a lot of pressure on their intermediaries, their bankers, their lawyers, to really move as quickly as possible to enable the private equity fund to be able to get in its bid and close the deal as expeditiously as possible. And particularly early in my career, I would be on deal calls all the time, in the middle of the night, all weekend. And it was funny because I would be at every event that our kids had, all of their sports events, but I would always have a phone in my ear. And I felt like I was a good dad because I was there. But, years later, upon reflection, I'm not sure that I was really present. And so that was a big theme throughout, particularly a lot of those early years. To do that job really well, you have to know what's going on all the time. A huge component of doing that job well, you are a quarterback for the deal from a legal perspective. And so what that means is you've really got to be a good project manager. And to be a good project manager, you need to be in the arena. You need to be on the field. You need to be on those calls. So, of course, it was very exciting to see a deal that I was working on be on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. But it was also very challenging because to do that job very well, you needed to be very immersed in the minutia, and that caused some challenges or some friction with my ability to also be a good dad or a good husband or find a better balance between my life at the office and my life outside of the office.
And I suspect it's that building of friction over time that motivated you to find a different path past the law firm.
Yeah. Again, like circling back to the comment that I made about my dad, to find something you love is such a treasure in terms of what you do professionally. And I liked being in the trenches. I liked seeing the deals that I was working on hit the newswire. I liked working with really smart clients and helping them solve hard problems and quarterbacking that process. But I never loved understanding how the market is moving on a deal point like indemnification. I never loved sitting in front of a laptop and drafting a purchase agreement. And I think it was probably inevitable. And I realized relatively early in my career that I wasn't going to end my career at Kirkland. It was more, I'm a relatively risk off person. And so it was more about trying to figure out how to create a logical evolution from doing deals and taking care of my family to eventually turning the corner and doing something else. But, when I did that something else, I wanted it to feel logical and a natural evolution. And that just took a lot of years to finally get to that point last month when I was ready to officially leave the firm and really get more immersed in some of the things that I'm now doing.
I just want to ask one more very specific question about being in the M&A side on the legal, just because it's fascinating to me, and the fact that you've been on both sides of the table as representing the buyers, but also going through a sale process yourself. And you mentioned everybody wanting to get to that closing table, knowing that the deal is going to get done. The buyer wants to know, and so does the seller. I mean, what are the things that happen at that very last minute, right? You spent 3+ months, maybe shorter in these larger deals, but significant amount of time to get to that closing table, and then all of a sudden, something happens that makes the deal not get done. What happens at that last minute?
I mean, all sorts of things can arise. A closing condition like a third-party consent might not come in. I mean, it's pretty rare. There could be a problem with your financing package. Maybe the bank or the arranger isn't able to syndicate it out at sort of the terms that sort of work for you. It's very frustrating. I think the good news is our private equity clients, they're willing to really get into the minutia of whatever the issue is that arises and understand it. They're willing to not just in a binary way decide, all right, we're not doing this deal. It's much more cerebral than that. It's much more about, okay, can we solve this problem? Can we allocate the risk appropriately so that each side can bear its share of whatever this condition not being satisfied arises, whatever that is. Can we box in and allocate the risk around that? There's always a tremendous amount of momentum moving forward to the closing. It's very hard when things suddenly pause and you go pencils down because you've got a significant issue that you need to work through. But more times than not, both sides are so invested into that transaction. The buyer, by investing everything that they've invested in from a cost and a time perspective, they're pretty committed to finding a path to still close on that acquisition. So it becomes more of an exercise of getting the right people together to brainstorm what are the alternatives for solving this problem. Some problems can't get solved, right? And some can, right? If it's an antitrust issue, would a divestiture solve the problem? If it's a third-party closing condition, can we shift the risk or can we adjust the purchase price to address that potential concern? And so the good news is, for the most part, the actors in private equity, they're not very emotional, not nearly as emotional as what in the subscale end of the market. They're much more willing to do the work to try to figure out whether that particular problem can get solved.
So then are you saying that it's perhaps much more common in the subsector of the market where ETA and search fund plays to have deals fall apart at the last minute than at the high level private equity?
I heard this the other day that something like 35% of SMB deals that get under exclusivity, right? So an LOI is signed, only somewhere around 35% of those deals get closed. I don't have any research to support that. I would not be surprised at all if it's true. We're under LOI right now for 3 deals. I hope to close at least 2 of them. We may only close 1. There's a lot of reasons for that. One, when you just think about how the process is set up. So in subscale M&A, oftentimes what happens is you do a limited amount of diligence up front before you lob in your LOI. That LOI is non-binding. It's subject to a bunch of conditionality. And only then during the exclusivity period does the buyer start to do a lot of the diligence. And a lot of that diligence also is financial in nature. You typically will run a quality of earnings assessment. And oftentimes that quality of earnings assessment comes back and the overall SDE or EBIT of the business is lighter than what had gotten reported out earlier in the process by the seller or by the seller's banker. And so that necessarily creates retrading because you as the buyer, you often set your offer, your valuation based upon the EBIT or the SDE or the cash flow that was reported out to you. And now you get through the QOV process and you get to a level of truth on the actual financial performance. That retrading often creates execution risk. Oftentimes you'll go back, you'll say, we need to adjust the purchase price. Now, for their part, the seller often, there's no misrepresentation. Maybe it was an accounting error or an accounting adjustment, or accounting is a somewhat subjective process. These are not audited financials that you receive with these small businesses. And so consequently, the headline is consequently, you are learning a lot about the business. You are learning a lot about the financial profile of the business during that exclusivity period that creates a much higher probability that you're not ever going to be able to get to the closing table. The financing arrangements, if you use an SBA 7A loan or third-party debt financing, it's just looser than the sorts of financing commitments that you'll receive from your banks in an upmarket private equity transaction. So now let's just shift for a second. So now in upmarket private equity, what happens? In upmarket private equity, as I said, there are almost always auctions for the company that's being sold. When you make your bid, oftentimes what happens is the seller and their investment banker will want all of the bidders to do as much work as possible, as much diligence as possible around the target company, so that when the bidders submit a non-binding indication of interest, a letter of intent, they want to make sure that whichever bidders they allow to go forward in the auction process have the highest probability of being real, of actually getting to a deal. And eventually what happens in upmarket private equity, which is a lot different than when you're operating and transacting in the subscale, is that the ultimate bidder that's successful in the auction, they sign a purchase agreement at that point. They sign a purchase agreement much earlier in the process, and then there's usually an executory period, like if you bought a house. You buy a house, sign a purchase agreement to buy the house, then you got to get your mortgage in place, you got to get your inspection done. There are conditions like that. World, buying a house looks a lot more like private equity than it does with subscale SMB M&A. And so consequently, when you do a deal in the subscale of the market, there's a much higher probability that you'll never get to a closing table. And the other reason why that's true too is like the seller may have never done a deal before in their life. And so they just don't know market norms like a private equity investment managing director will. And so that consequently creates a lot of other challenges, and it creates the possibility that the seller might just want to take his or her toys and go home. They might not have the energy, while they're still operating the business, by the way, to actually figure out and be creative and show a willingness to want to be creative, to navigate whatever issues you, as the buyer, as the prospective buyer, are bringing to them. And so consequently, for all those reasons, the two worlds are pretty dramatically different. I guess maybe in some ways positively, in some ways negatively.
That was a really good explanation. I see why you teach this.
Thank you.
I want to fast forward just a little bit. I know how involved you are in the ETA community and search fund community as an active participant in a lot of ways. You recently co-authored a paper talking about what search fund and ETA investors do and don't do. And it was a no-nonsense paper. I think you hit hard on some themes that particularly aspiring CEOs or even CEOs that are in the seat now should consider. Would you like to maybe comment on some of those? I mean, when I read it, they hit hard. As I said, it was no nonsense. Like, this is the way the game is.
Yeah, so maybe a few thoughts. So search fund investing has been around for decades. As we zoom out, I mean, I want to start by just saying I and the other authors, we love investors. Investment capital is an imperative, often, to getting deals done. And the paper was certainly not intended in any way to be a criticism of investors. But investor capital is expensive. It just is. If you go out and you raise a search fund, you're going to give your investors usually at least 75% of the equity capital of your business. And we do think it's important for potential searchers who are raising capital, whether in a search fund or maybe just equity capital to underwrite a 7A finance deal, to step back and really assess, what am I getting from my investors? Am I simply getting capital, which again, critical ingredient, or am I also expecting my investors to roll up their sleeves and help me find a deal, which is pretty unlikely? Am I also expecting my investors to help me run this business day to day, which again is pretty unlikely? You will have a board. If you raise a search fund, that board will absolutely be helpful, particularly at pivotal times, like when you're ready to go to market and sell your business and you need to find a banker or you need to find the right lawyer. They absolutely will be available to help review the financial plan or the operating plan that you're putting together. But we thought it was important to just take a snapshot of the world and assess and help searchers calibrate around what are the sorts of things that investors typically do and what are some of the things that they don't, and why don't they do those things? Well, some of it's just the practical reality. I'm a search fund investor and I raise a $50 million fund and I'm going to invest in 70 searchers across 2 or 3 years. Purely from a leverage perspective, I don't have the infrastructure to actually go out and meaningfully contribute to that search process, to help that searcher do proprietary outreach, to help that searcher put together their term sheet or their LOI. It's just purely a matter of commercial practicability. And so none of this is good, none of this is bad. We just thought that it would be valuable and important to take a moment and take a look out into the landscape and author this paper around what are some of the reasonable expectations that searchers should have or operators should have for their investors, and what are some of the things that those investors are unlikely to do.
I thought it was also smart to call out, make no mistake, this is a financial arrangement, and understand that.
Yeah, that's right. I think that there are a couple of norms that sort of play into that. First, the ETA space is very collaborative, very generally pretty collegial. And it can be easy when you're thinking about doing a search or raising a search fund or starting from the starting line to create expectations that collegiality or that support will play out with your investors too. And in some ways it will. But, at the end of the day, investors are generally rational economic actors. And while they may become your friends, that syndicate of investors or your board members may eventually become personal acquaintances. Certainly, when you're getting off that starting line, it's important to understand from an alignment of interest perspectives that those investors have made an investment in you, and that's the primary lens or aperture by which they're going to be thinking about their relationship with you.
Brian, your background is fascinating to me personally, just being in the ETA space myself for 3-4 years at this point. I could talk to you for hours, but I think you've given us a lot of really good insight into your career and some good leadership lessons to think about and learn from. I appreciate your time sharing all of that with us.
I really appreciate being here with you today. I think that I was having a discussion the other day about just what's going on in the space. It's becoming crowded. There are more and more searchers entering the space every day. There are more searchers seeking to raise funds. And the question was, if we hit peak SMB M&A in a sense. And my reaction to that is, like, in some ways, there's a lot of truth to that. It has gotten very crowded. It's gotten very crowded as well because private equity has really moved down market. And they're starting to compete from a bolt-on acquisition perspective with many of these searchers, certainly once you're at $1 million or $2 million of EBITDA. But there's a lot of really positive things that are happening too. The number of tools available to searchers and operators continues to grow on like an exponential basis. And I do think that searchers can continue to differentiate themselves. There are some sellers who don't want to sell to private equity. And so I'm convinced that transacting at the subscale end of the market is going to continue to be a really interesting way for first-time operators to enter into the space and buy an asset and grow that asset and sell it for a profit. But it's not going to be easy. And so folks who are considering doing a search, who are considering going out and buying a small business, they should take the time to really step back and listen to these podcasts, have a bunch of conversations with searchers, not only who have been successful, but searchers who haven't been successful, and really collect a lot of data points. Because at the end of the day, going out and buying a small business is about two things. It's about understanding substantively how to do it, but it's also about conviction building. And part of that conviction building is really collecting those data points and getting to a fair and a balanced place where that would-be searcher has decided that this is how they want to spend the next 5 to 7 years of their life, rather than all of the other interesting things out there that they could be doing. So thanks a lot for making time for me. I think it's wonderful that you're doing this podcast, and I really enjoyed our time together.
I think that's a great conclusion, Brian. I know you put out a lot of really good content on LinkedIn in particular. Is that the best place for somebody to find you?
Yeah, find me on LinkedIn, Brian, WOL, F as in Frank, E, or visit fundedventures.com. But definitely, I have a lot of fun just sharing what I'm learning and reading what other folks are sharing in the community as well. So thanks very much.